Welcome back to GBN Tonight with me, Christopher Hope. Now, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has claimed she will detain more illegal migrants and carry out a record number of deportations. Labour is pressing ahead with the previous Tory government's plan to reopen 2 immigration centres in a bid to achieve what it hopes will be the highest rate of removals since 2018, when Theresa May was the Prime Minister. Nearly 300 places will be created by reopening these 2 centres in Oxfordshire and Hampshire. They had previously been closed by the last Tory government after people had tried to physically harm themselves. But reopening these centres is not what the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, said when he was in opposition. Then he pledged to defend migrants' rights and to instead call for the closures of detention centres. Well, an Ipsos Mori poll from last Friday showed that immigration is now the top issue for voters. But previous statistics show that 95% of people in detention centres were ultimately released. Is Labour doing its job to tackle migration at its root cause and, as it wants to do, smash the gangs? Joining me now is Kay Marsh, a Migrant Supply Coordinator based in Dover. Kay, thank you for joining us tonight on GBN Tonight. Is this the right answer, reopening these 2 centres?
Absolutely not, especially not at the moment. We have an issue with detention centres in the UK. I think it was July this year, the prison inspectorate found that Harmondsworth has the worst conditions they've ever seen. We need to look at that first. We need to fix the problems that are already there with the detention system before we even think about opening new ones.
Is part of the problem ditching the Rwanda plan? Was that ever going to work, in your view?
Absolutely not. I think that's the one thing that we can all agree Labour did that was really good so far, ditching the Rwanda plan. It was expensive. It was never going to work. It was built on lies and, people just thought it was this sort of fix everything, and it certainly wasn't. So that's a good thing, at least.
But in that case, what will work? I mean, do you think that you can have better coordination with enforcement bodies on the continent? Is that going to work? Or will it be 100 more staff recruited a day for the National Crime Agency? Is that going to work?
Well, the issue with removals has always been that there wasn't adequate return agreements in place. So, with third countries and home countries, the return agreements just weren't there, and you can't return somebody if the country you're returning them to doesn't agree to that. And of course, we can't send people back to an active war zone. So there's a lot of people that will never be sent back to anywhere. And even if this all came together and the removals came up to this sort of level, promised by Yvette Cooper, it's a sticking plaster, isn't it? Unless we actually fix the issue of the small boats, it's just going to keep happening. At the moment, we have a lot of failed asylum seekers and people who, go through the asylum system and don't get a positive outcome. And that is because at the moment we don't have adequate, safe and legal routes into the country. So we've got legitimate people and, say, people that don't have a legitimate claim to asylum all come in here on boats. And then we have to work out at this end who should and who shouldn't stay. If we had a mechanism where people could start their asylum claim before needing to come to Britain, before needing to be on British soil, we could start that process a lot earlier and we could weed out a lot of people a lot earlier in the process.
Is that even realistic before they make that dangerous crossing and pay a couple of £1,000s to a people trafficking gang to start processing them in northern France? Is that even a realistic opportunity thing? Because they do throw away their ID on the way here, many, don't they?
I think, again, we have to realise that some of these sort of inflammatory statements aren't necessarily as true as they're made out to be in the media. So the majority of people, everyone who has a legitimate claim to asylum would, I'm sure, jump at the chance not to have to get into a small boat, not to have to take that risk and spend that money. A processing centre in northern France is an option. If we can do it in Rwanda, we can certainly do it in northern France. Why aren't we doing that? Online portal, start your asylum claim online, humanitarian visa scheme like we saw in Ukraine. That was very successful, very quickly.
So if you established a processing centre in near Dover, and then those who are allowed to come here were brought across normally in a legal way, that might stop the illegal crossings.
I think it would certainly curb illegal crossings, and we would have a much better view of who was legitimate and who may not be. Because, if you've got a legitimate claim, you're not going to get in a small boat. You're going to take the safe and legal route where you get brought here nicely on a boat, So anybody caught getting into a small boat would then be heavily questioned, why you're not taking the safe and legal route. I think it would be a lot easier to manage asylum in this country.
Well, Kay Marsh, Migration Support Coordinator in Dover, thank you for joining us tonight on GBN Tonight. With me in the studio here is Kwasi Kwarteng, the former Tory Chancellor, and Lord Rossell-Moyle, former Labour MP. Lord, is Kay Marsh right there? Because she's saying there that an easier way might be sort of processing individuals in France and then bring them over legally, and that may stop the illegal arrivals.
She's broadly right. I mean, let's remember that arrivals from irregular means are actually down from what they were 15 years ago. It's just 15 years ago people came in the back of trucks, and now a smaller number is coming over on the boats. So it's
because they dealt with the Eurotunnel.
Yes, it's actually a reducing problem, but the problem has been that it's then also more dangerous. And so we do need to tackle it. And personally, I think the idea of a French processing centre where you can be carrot and stick about this. And you can say, OK, we've seen that you're arriving on a dinghy. We're going to pick you up, make sure you're safe, and we're going to take you straight to our processing centre, which happens to be in northern France, and we'll send you straight back there. We'll process you there, and then we will see where you can go. Now, of course, there is a problem, which is numbers, isn't it? Let's get to the number of it. It's
always numbers.
If you do an online application system, you could have half the world applying. And I think that what we need to do is be realistic. We need to say that there is a certain number that we need for real humanitarian issues, special programmes, and we need to be more generous on those special programmes.
Yes.
The Syrian scheme's shut, the Afghan scheme's shut. On the other side, I think that it would be totally reasonable to say this is the number. 50,000, whatever the number is, 10,000, 2, whatever the number politicians want, to say each year, this is the number beyond the special schemes that we're willing to take. And once that is up, then I'm afraid it's up. And maybe you divvy it out monthly, and that's how we used to do visas in this country.
Kwasi Kwarteng, isn't what Lloyd's saying what David Cameron tried to do from those Syrian camps years ago?
Yeah, he did. But the issue was that since 2018, it got out of hand. And Lloyd's quite right. I think the absolute numbers are lower than they were 15 years ago. But optically, seeing people on dinghies being trafficked in dangerous conditions and then arriving in Britain without any ID is unacceptable. And people say that, look, the gangs, the traffickers are benefiting. And that's why the Rwanda scheme, which I supported, was a very clear deterrent for people not to come to this country. But of course, we couldn't.
And anecdotally, it was working.
It was beginning to work.
Slightly around the edge of the thought it might be working.
But the issue and I think this was a fundamental issue with the Conservative Party, was that if we weren't willing to leave the ECHR, put that on the table, it was obvious that the scheme at some point would fall down because they would simply appeal to the ECHR.
Individual claims were going.
And the ECHR would have just waved them through.
Yeah.
So that was the weakness.
Is Kwasi right, Lord Rossell-Moyle? The mistake was not even to try and make Rwanda work, because according to the Tory government, as we know during the campaign, it was the flight's about to take off. Why not let some flights take off, prove it to be a failure, if it's a failure, and then move on?
Well, the problem with the Rwanda scheme is it wasn't actually a scheme on how to become a refugee in the UK. It was a scheme where we bundled people off to Rwanda, and if you were then processed, you stayed in Rwanda.
Yes, you couldn't come back.
Yeah, and it was also a scheme that the most vulnerable refugees from Rwanda that might have got to Rwanda via neighbouring countries, so not the flights, were then repatriated back to Britain. So we had to have the cost of all these very vulnerable refugees that Rwanda would send to us in a tit-for-tat kind of arrangement. It was bonkers. I think that there is some discussion to be had about numbers, and there is some discussion about offshore processing, but it needs to be done in a humane way, and it needs to be done in a way that when you pick people up, rather than it being indefinite, you know the time limit. Yeah. And I think that was the key on Keir Starmer's pledge. What he said is we would get rid of indefinite detention. And the problem with those Yarl's Woods is that you have people put there for years and years. You don't know how long they'll be there, and then they cause real problems. We need to speed up the processing. Fair but firm. Fair but fast.
But the issue that I think they're missing in this government is the fact that, and Lloyd probably won't agree with me, but the system was being abused. I mean, not all the people, I think a large number of the people who were coming on the boats weren't legitimate asylum seekers. And that
Well,
was
the majority
So-
were granted asylum, so you could say that the system was incorrectly identifying them, but when they were identified, the majority were asylum seekers.
But there had to be an element of deterrent in this system. And the Rwanda was a deterrent. It clearly was that. And people were actually going to Ireland. There were reports of people going to Ireland because they feared the being deported
the reports
to Rwanda.
also in Northern France were not coming across because of
Exactly.
of
And it was effective in that regard.
Lloyd, do you worry about the slowness in establishing this border command, this new idea, this enforcement boss? We haven't yet found that 6 weeks, 7 weeks into Labour government, no one appointed yet.
Well, 6 weeks is a very short time,
Well,
including over the summer. So look, I would
But
expect...
they're coming 5,000 across since the election.
Yes. Look, we are not going to turn the tap off tomorrow, but what I expect is by Christmas, by the new year, that we to start to see real progress on this. And if there isn't, then I think the public will be rightly saying, we've given you 6 months. What have you been doing?